Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of The Wonderful World of Wine, exploring trending topics and trying to make wine fun and accessible for all of you, our listeners. And I am here with my co-host, Mark. How are you doing today, Mark?
Great, Kim. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Always thinking about wine,
That's
kind
right.
of our thing.
That's our job.
That's our job.
To let everyone know what we're finding in the world of wine. I think we have a nice topic to start with, Kim, that is, I think is very interesting.
Yes, we have a fun one today. And as everyone knows, we sometimes like to think outside the box about wine. And it's not just, what are you drinking with your meal or, as we get a little kind of geeky and think about the science behind the wine and the, areas where it's grown and places you could go on vacation. Today's article that we are investigating is from Cookus.com, and it's 15 weird things that you can do with wine. Now, not all of these are weird, but there are some different things that go beyond just having a glass of wine either on its own or with your meal. And I thought that this list was great because it kind of ran the gamut. Like there's a whole bunch of different things that they talk about, from consuming it to putting it on your skin to using it in your compost pile. So there's a lot to talk about in this one.
There was a few that stuck out to me that were a little different I never heard of. And then when the topic came up, I mentioned to you, Kim, that I think we should add, when we talk about each one, we'll give kind of a guidance. Do you want to use a leftover wine? Would you want to use a fresh wine? Or would both work? So when we go through them, I think we'll give our 2 cents, and I'm sure we'll differ on a lot of those, as we always do. But what's the first one on the list, Kim?
So the first one on the list is to freeze your leftover wine into ice cubes. And they do specify your leftover wine. So you've got a bottle open and you're not going to finish it. What do you do with that last, couple of inches of the bottle? Freeze it into ice cubes and then use those ice cubes to chill down your future glass of wine. We all know those people who like to have their wine super duper cold. My mother is one of them. And it's nice to have something that will keep your wine really cold without necessarily diluting it. So I think that's the smart thing about this suggestion, is that it takes the place of something and makes your wine better. So instead of putting a regular ice cube in your glass of Chardonnay and then you have watered down diluted Chardonnay, you put a Chardonnay cube in your glass of Chardonnay and you haven't diluted the wine, but you get it to that nice cold temperature that you like.
Yeah, the ice in the wine thing is probably one of my biggest pet peeves in the wine world. And my wife does it all the time. And I cringe, but she wants, like you said, they want it ice cold. And this is a great solution to not water it down, like you were saying, Kim. And I think it also leads to other things you could experiment with, maybe a red wine ice cube in your white wine and make it a rosé, or adding other flavor white wines into your wine as an ice cube to give it different flavors, like a Pinot Grigio maybe into your Chardonnay or something like that. So I think it could be fun.
And I think that this could also have a use when you're making sangria too. So if you are making a pitcher of sangria and you have wine ice cubes in your freezer, you can put those wine ice cubes into your sangria as you serve it. And I think that would be fantastic, because then you are not, diluting your sangria. You're not diluting your beverage, and you have this extra hit of yumminess in your glass. So yeah, like you said, there are all sorts of applications for this.
That's a great idea.
I've seen ideas where people say freeze grape and use the frozen grapes as your ice cubes, which would also work well. But I kind of like this idea of, throwing one wine container of ice cubes in your freezer and all sorts of uses.
I've seen it where people put little chunks of fruit when they make the ice. So when you do the sangria, then it looks really nice that you're floating around frozen.
You've got like a raspberry or a strawberry or something like that.
And then
mint leaves.
Melts.
You can also do mint leaves. Yeah.
It's a good idea. Now, we talked here about using the ice to cool the drink. What about ice cubes you make to use for cooking?
Oh, Yeah, so
We talked, I
kind of
believe we
like,
talked about this before, where you use some old wine, you make it an ice cube, and then you use it as a base, correct?
sure.
For cooking?
Yep. And I do this with broth all the time. So I'll make, say I'm making, a pot of chicken broth that I know I'm going to save for future cooking. Some of it I will reduce down more than if I was going to just be using it for soup. And I'll have that concentrated broth that I then freeze and put aside so that I don't have to do the step of reducing it before I put it in my pan sauce. And you absolutely can do that with wine too. You wouldn't necessarily have to cook it and reduce it first, but you could, and that would get rid of some of the alcohol with retaining the flavor of the wine. Or you could add it to another type, like you could add it to the broth and then freeze those together. And that would be an excellent way to really make your meal prep a whole lot quicker. So you don't have to, open a whole bottle of wine if your recipe only calls for like a quarter cup or even just a few tablespoons. You would just have it right there in the freezer, and that would really cut down on your meal prep time and on having to open another bottle. Not that I ever have a problem with opening a bottle of wine to cook with, because then I'm just going to drink it. But, it's nice to have those little shortcuts with your meal planning.
I'm curious how much fruit flavor you get in the wine after it's frozen like that.
Well, I mean, you're going to cook it down anyway.
No, I mean, just from the ice cube perspective, as it melts in your drink, you think it's really has any fruit left after it's frozen?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to keep my wines pretty cold in my refrigerator, like down near freezing, like, 30 whatever degrees. And I don't ever find that they suffer. So I would not think that they would lose a lot of their flavor while being frozen. So maybe that's a good thing to experiment with.
Yeah, I think we should experiment and put it in.
Right. I'm going to go freeze some wine.
Yeah. We'll follow up on that. So next they were talking about skincare, which you mentioned earlier, Kim, as an unusual use for wine.
Yeah, I think this is kind of unusual.
We've mentioned this in the past where there were baths, like wine baths you could soak in because they said it was good for your skin.
And there are whole companies dedicated to making skincare product out of leftover materials from winemaking. So there is one company that I know is that's based out of France that does like salt scrubs and like scrubbies that use the seeds and the pumice from leftover great material after making wine. So this is something that is fairly common, but this recommendation was using wine, and they did say specifically red wine in the article, as like a toner or an anti-inflammatory, because tannins do have anti-inflammatory properties. So I think that's why they were suggesting red wine. Hopefully it wouldn't stain your skin. I think this maybe would work a little bit better with folks who have a darker skin tone, because you're not going to see as much of the red pigment from the wine. But I guess if you're dabbing it on your skin and then you wash it off, you're not going to see a lot of red wine on your skin. But this is not anything that I ever would have considered doing before, but interesting.
So the idea is what, Kim? You just rub it?
We'd put it on a cotton ball and then just sort of dab it all over your face. So it would eliminate some of the oils, and it would tone up your pores.
Well, it's interesting, and it's all forms of the wine. We it's this, in this point, it's not leftover or new. It's usually the components from wine waste, or like you said. So I'm curious if you would use like a liquid form versus the components that make up.
This seems like the liquid, and this would be the kind of thing that you could use your wine that maybe has been on your counter for a little too long. It doesn't necessarily taste its best anymore, but this would be a good use for it because it still has all those chemical components in it. So you're not going for the flavor of the wine. You're going for that chemical makeup of the wine instead.
And I've seen it, like I said before, Kim, where they have bathhouses that you just soak in red wine. So
I can't imagine what you come out smelling like if you've been soaking in wine.
Yeah, it's definitely going to smell bad. The red wine doesn't smell good after a while.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine getting pulled over after that? You must just reek of alcohol.
Not good.
No.
Good for the skin. Good for the skin.
Good for the skin. Maybe not so good for your record. All right. The next one on the list, and I don't know that I necessarily buy this one, was to rinse your fruits and vegetables with them, because there have been some studies that have shown that because of their the antibacterial properties of alcohol and these other things in wine, that they possibly could kill things like E. coli or listeria on your fruits and vegetables.
Never heard of this.
Yeah, I don't know that I buy this.
Fruits or veggies, they were saying. And once again, they were saying the red wine. I've never heard of this. I mean, obviously cooking we've heard of, but just rinsing your vegetables with red wine.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I wouldn't use the new wine. I guess
otherwise you would just use water. So, and wine is mostly water, so it wouldn't hurt. But I don't know that I buy the idea that this would kill E. coli on your broccoli.
Yeah, I'm curious if any of the listeners have experimented with this for any reason at all. I think it's a waste of good and bad wine.
I agree.
Honest. The next one, Kim, was interesting to me as well, saying an unusual use for wine would be to catch flies. Now, I don't know what they're talking about here because all I've noticed is wine draws more fruit flies. I don't think it really catches them as much as it attracts them.
Well, that's the point.
Take on that?
That I do this.
You just let
Did you know that I do this?
What's the reasoning?
So fruit flies really love wine. Like I catch them in my glass all the time, and it's really annoying because
you're using it as a trap. You're trapping.
Using it as a trap.
Okay.
So what I do is I get a little bowl or a little ramekin, and I put some wine or some vinegar, or sometimes wine and a piece of like peach or a piece of banana or something that is going to attract the fruit flies. And then you put a piece of cling wrap, saran wrap, plastic wrap on top of it, and poke just a few little holes in with a toothpick. And the fruit flies smell it through the holes, and they climb in through the holes, and then they either die in the liquid or they just can't find their way back out again because they don't have any way to smell the clean air. So they get trapped in there, and it makes a great fruit fly trap in your kitchen.
Yeah, I've never.
But the key is put the plastic wrap on so they can't get out.
Yeah, it seems like no matter how many of those I put out, they still get attracted to my wine or my wine dispenser. And
I would think wine dispensers. Yeah,
they're one of those little pests. Like I just don't understand where the heck they come from. But once they
especially
stop,
this time of year, like if people get fresh vegetables from a local farm stand or farmers market, they just they're everywhere. They definitely are a summer nuisance.
I tried lemon oil, I think, one time because they said that gets rid of fruit flies, and I didn't have any luck with that either. But I guess I'm making the traps wrong. Probably made the holes too big, and they're just escaping, right?
Cider vinegar also works really well. But wine, I have found that wine is one of the best attracted for fruit flies. Follow my method; it really does work.
Well, vinegar is a good lead into the next thing they said is an unusual or weird thing to do with wine is just make vinegar, which to me is not very unusual or weird.
And has thousands of years of history behind it.
And you're big on this, right, Kim? You're doing this all the time.
I do this, yeah. So I have two
white wine, red
fermenters. Wine? I have two. I have a red and a white.
Wow.
So I have two big fermenters going on downstairs in my basement, right near where we're making the mead. And it has older wine, which I don't tend to use good drinking wine. I tend to use bottles that are either way past their prime or wines that have been open for a really long time, and I can't do anything else with them. And the thing about making vinegar out of wine is that you need a starter culture to start. So it's called a mother. It looks like a jellyfish. It's very slimy, but they're very, very easy to buy. You can go on Amazon and buy vinegar mothers. And sometimes if you buy vinegar in the store, there are certain brands that are considered living vinegars and still have their mother in them. So there are some certain cider vinegar brands that will come with the mother. I haven't tried using one of those and trying to make a big batch of new vinegar with those mothers. I've bought mine online, and then I just keep using them because for some reason mine just don't die. And it's half wine and half water. So you use the same amount of water as you use wine and a vinegar mother. And I put them in my big containers, and they take about 6 months to go from wine to vinegar. And it's wonderful. I give it as gifts. I use it in salad dressing. It's not as strong as what you would buy at the store. So those are usually about 5% acidity. These are closer to 4%. So you can't use them to make pickles, but you can use them to make everything else. And they're really quite delicious.
Seems like a lot of work, Kim.
It's not a lot of work, but it is a lot of time.
Yeah.
So, me and my crazy projects that I'm always making at home. It's not necessarily that they're very labor intensive, but they are very time intensive. But you can get a lot from one batch. So I usually use probably 6 bottles of wine and then 6 bottles of water in any one particular batch. And then over time that turns into vinegar. And then I have a number of bottles of vinegar. So that'll last me a while.
Well, you're still my go-to to give you my old wine. So you find uses for it. So. You can gladly.
I do appreciate that.
Wow. I can't believe you make that. You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. If you'd like more information about Kim, please go to her website at vinitaswineworks.com. If you'd like more information about myself, please go to franklinliquors.com. And you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. We'd like any questions or comments that you would have. Today, we're talking about 15 weird and unusual uses for wine. And the next thing they're saying is unusual, Kim, which was new to me again, was cleaning your windows with wine. Have you ever done or heard of this?
No, and I don't think I would. I would use vinegar. If I didn't have window cleaner, the next best thing I would say would be vinegar. But I think that the thinking is the same. White wine especially is high in acid. Acid is good for cleaning windows, hence use white wine to clean windows.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to use wine on my.
To me, it doesn't seem clean. You know, it's just.
Yeah. Because there's other things in wine other than that little bit of acidity.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then my dog would lick the windows and she'd lick the wine.
Probably get some weird birds doing or animals or something. Drunk birds, right? That's just unusual. That really is. This is the one that probably stood out the most.
Yeah, this one was a little strange.
It was really strange.
Yeah, I prefer the ones where you actually consume the wine in some form.
That's what they're saying. The next one, marinating meats, Kim.
And this is another one I do all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of recipes out there for, marinade things. White wine, red wine, even fortified wine. I have a number of recipes that use vermouth or that use, sherry or Madeira or anything like that. So using wine in cooking and especially as marinade is a fantastic way to use up some older bottles.
This is one, it will surprise you, Kim. I actually did this once, and I'm not the foodie at all, but I marinated some steaks in port because I read an article. And my God, it tasted so much like port. It was unbelievable. It overpowered.
Was it bad? It was too much?
No, it was just, it tasted like port. It wasn't like a normal seasoning, it was just overpoweringly port tasting.
Were you following a recipe?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I poured whatever it said and marinated for so many hours.
So it did specify use port?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Port infused steaks. And it was strong. What's your favorite wine to use as a marinade?
Something European without a lot of oak. So probably some sort of inexpensive Sangiovese. I use a lot of Côte de Rhône in cooking, especially the less expensive ones that aren't like overly oaky. Less expensive Tempranillos from Spain also I tend to use in cooking a lot because the fruitiness comes through, but not the oakiness. So I like sort of the purity of the red fruit to come through in marinades. I use more red wine for marinades than I do for white wines, regardless of what it is. So even if I'm doing like a chicken dish and you're afraid that, your chicken is going to come out pink because you're using red wine, I often throw in like a little bit of balsamic vinegar too and some other things. And unless it's coq au vin and it comes out very pink, the color usually isn't too impacted by the color of the wine.
Nice.
But a lot of steak tips and bone-in chicken, and I don't necessarily do a lot of pork unless they're spare ribs marinated. Now I'm getting hungry.
You got me hungry again. Let's move on. The next was unusual use was for gardening, and you mentioned this earlier, saying that the yeast in wine is good for soil. But I was under the impression this is more like waste of the wine, correct? Not like a liquid wine.
Now, this one was confusing to me. So they said to use your leftover wine and dump it in your compost pile because the yeast and the nitrogen and all of that is good for your compost pile. But the yeast in your bottle of wine is already dead.
Yeah,
if there's any yeast let in there, it's already gone. It's either not there, or if there is a little bit of sediment in the bottom of your bottle, that's dead yeast. That stuff's not, doing anything in your compost pile. So I was a little confused by this one.
Yeah,
I'm under the assumption that they're talking about bottles of wine because people most likely are not going to have leftover the stuff from making wine.
Even the stuff, the pumice and stuff wouldn't really have active yeast.
No.
It would be dead. No. So,
but that stuff would be good for your compost pile. And I have a compost pile, so of course.
That's a weird one.
Yeah, that was up there with cleaning the windows.
The next thing really wasn't weird or unusual to me. That said, make a spritzer with your wine, and
yep.
We did a whole show on the Aperol spritzer and other spritzers, Prosecco for spritzers. So this wasn't weird or unusual to me, Kim.
No, No, but this is kind of the reverse of those spritzers. So in the case of the Aperol spritz, your bubbles are coming from your wine because you're using a sparkling wine. You're using a Prosecco. This one's the opposite. This one, you're using still wine as your wine base, but then you're adding like a bubbly water to it. So it's kind of a different riff on it, but it sort of ties in with sangrias and wine cocktails. And summer is still sangria season. And, you know, you could do white, you could do red, you could do bubbly, you can mix it up with flavors and fruits and cordials and whatever you want to do. So I kind of feel like the spritzer is sort of the sister wine cocktail to all those sangrias. So I think that this is a great idea.
Yeah, it's always my favorite lately for a spritzer has been white port with a little sparkling water, some lime, good refreshing drink.
Lovely. That sounds great.
Yeah,
There's not a lot of white port out there. What brand do you have?
I just use whatever. Lately I've had Dow, I've had Sanderman. They all make it, but you don't see it too often.
Yeah. And they're nice because, you know, they're a little bit sweet, but they're not that heavy cloying sweetness of red ports. They're actually quite refreshing. I think that they're really delicious and that they should be a little bit more well known because they are really
still a lot of alcohol, but you water it down.
That's true.
You water it down. How about making, what was the next one, Kim? For, it was a frozen dessert, right?
Yeah. So granitas.
Granita.
Yeah, which is like Italian ice. So making a slightly boozy granita where it, you know, sometimes it can be just as easy as having those wine ice cubes and put them in a blender or put them in, you know, some sort of machine that mashes things up. Even a Cuisinart would work fine. And you make just like an icy, refreshing, it doesn't have to be complicated, although you can infuse different fruit flavors or herbal flavors in your wine, and it's just a nice like palate cleanser or simple dessert or refreshing thing for after a meal.
And they said it's a frozen dessert popular in Sicily.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to make
and you find all
Sicilian
sorts of flavors, you know, there's fruit flavors, there's, like you said, these wine flavor ones, and they're, you know, where we got the idea of Italian ice from.
The next one, Kim, unusual use was dye something with your wine.
This was another kind of strange one that I hadn't thought of.
Yeah. It's funny story with this, Kim, is I saw an article a while ago before this one, and I sent it to my daughter, and so she started her own wine dye shirt company.
Really?
And had some good response. She called it Tannins and Co. And she can. You'd be surprised. You know, I have a lot of leftover wine. I sample some, and I'll leave it, and she's stealing all my wine, and she's learning. Samples. Yeah, she's learning what is the better wine to dye with. You know, obviously, the darker, the Syrah or Cab will stain certain clothing better than others. So you can definitely do this. It does smell when you soak it, and then you have to wash it out and make it nice and fresh, but it does work. So if people want to experiment with that, it is unusual, but it does work.
Well, I could have all my tablecloths be done this way because they're all covered in wine stains anyway.
Yeah, it's a good reason to do it. Yeah.
Well, good for her for doing something creative at this crazy time.
Yeah, and people have been receptive to it, so awesome. It's definitely fun. And what was the next? Another food. Oh, actually, the next three.
Yeah, I think most of them. The rest of them are edible things.
All food, syrups, jellies, ganache. Right, those are all suggestions for wine. And
and popsicles are the last one.
Have you done any of these, Kim? Syrup, jelly.
I've definitely done reductions. I haven't done any jellies, but I was thinking along the same lines of doing jelly. You could do Jell-O as well, and you could make like little wine Jell-O jiggler kind of things. I know I've seen them in the store where they have little bear gummy bears that are made from, they say, sparkling wine or rosé, which are totally adorable.
The Prosecco ones.
Yeah, you could totally do that with making Jell-O jigglers and just get packages of either flavored Jell-O or unflavored gelatin and just follow the package directions and use a little bit of wine in those. And those are fun adult little treats. But jelly, like we see red pepper jelly all the time. And there are a couple of recipes that I have for some of those more unusual jellies that do call for wine in the recipe. I have one that calls for a sweet wine, so it specifies Moscato. But there are a lot of ways that you could use that in those sort of cooking things. You'd boil out all the alcohol, so there wouldn't be any, but the flavor would still remain behind.
I did try champagne jelly one time because I was all excited about it, but it didn't taste like champagne at all to me. I was kind of disappointed.
It retained a little bit of a winey flavor, but I don't think that we would necessarily be able to taste. If we lined up a champagne jelly and a Merlot jelly and Sauvignon Blanc jelly, because when something is so cooked down like that, you really do lose a lot of the nuances of the flavor of the wine.
It's a good idea for a pairing event, though, using the jelly, like a Merlot or a Cab jelly with the Cab and to enhance it a little bit. How about Grenache?
File that one in the back of my mind for tasting.
Do you make any wine Grenache? Ganache? It's Ganache.
I have never made Ganache with wine. No.
So the
I've
idea
never
is
even thought
just
of
adding
it
to the chocolate? I mean...
Yeah, so I think what you would do is you would probably add it to the chocolate. I don't know if the wine would break the cream, though. So I don't know. Maybe you add it to the chocolate first, and then you add it to the cream. I don't know. Might need to experiment.
Yeah, you're going to have to...
All these ideas.
You're supposed to know this. Being the food.
Well, I don't tend to do wine and chocolate together. See, this is my downfall with not liking wine with sweet foods.
It says wine, chocolate, cream. Sounds easy, but you're saying that there could be some issues.
There might be some issues.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't want to waste a whole pint of cream. That's what food experimenting is about, right?
Yeah. The last one, which you can experiment a lot with, I would assume, is the adult popsicles with wine. It's simply wine, fruit, vinegar, and sugar. Vinegar,
right.
I thought, what do you need the vinegar for, Kim?
Probably just bump up the flavor. They specify balsamic vinegar in this particular recipe. And I know I've seen a lot of recipes where they've used balsamic vinegar and like berries in red wine. And the balsamic just sort of brings out the berry flavor in all of those things. So I think in this case, it's to highlight some of those red berry flavors.
Have you ever made wine popsicles?
No, I tried making margarita popsicles, but that didn't work.
Yeah, you hear that more often. People doing the more alcohol.
It was more like that granita. It was like a slushy.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Something about it doesn't really interest me to try it. But
I would totally try wine popsicles.
Would you recommend, it doesn't matter with this fresh wine or older wine?
I would think that you would want fresh wine for this one because you're not cooking the wine. So you kind of want to keep some of those fresher flavors. Whereas if you're making a reduction or a syrup, then it's fine to use older because you're going to be cooking it down a little bit more anyway. For something like sangria, if you use a wine that's been open for a few days, you're going to add other fruit juice and other stuff to it too. So it doesn't necessarily have to be. And then with cooking, just in general, usually okay. But I think if you are doing something where you want a little bit of that fresh fruitiness of the wine, you're better off going with a newly opened bottle and something that hasn't mellowed and kind of lost some of its flavor. Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We've been your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone. You can find us every week at this time, talking about trends and topics in the wine world. You can find past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. And as always, please leave us your questions and comments on our Facebook page, The Wonderful World of Wine. Cheers! Bye.